Hi everyone. So today we're going to pick up where we left off. My dog thinks that I'm talking to her. Come here, Lucy. Come here. Come here. You want to say hi? You want to say hi? See, she thinks every time I talk, I'm talking to her. Anyway, we're going to pick up where we left off. Chapter 2 is a long one, and we left off with Jamestown. It took a while for us to establish England securing a foothold in their North American colonies. And now what we're going to see is with the demise kind of as Spain as a world power and the rise of England, more and more English people are going to start coming over to the Americas and settling their colonies. The next one is going to be Plymouth. Now, other people were coming over, but they don't really establish large colonies. It's mostly fishermen. They have fishing villages and that sort of thing in New England. But Plymouth we know a lot about. It was established in 1620 by the Pilgrims on the Mayflower, right? So it's kind of American legend. So anyway, these people, they wanted to practice their own religion, and it differed from that of the Anglican Church. Now remember, the Anglican Church, the Church of England, was created by Henry VIII when he wanted a divorce. And so he made that the official Church of England. And if you went against the church, you were going against him because he was kind of, in a sense, the Pope of the Church of England. And so a lot of people didn't want to practice that sort of Christianity because they believed that it strayed too far from the original teachings of Jesus Christ, and it had too much of the ceremonies and the dogma and the traditions that the Catholic Church had, because it was just basically in name only different from the Catholic Church. And so these people, a lot of people wanted to purify it. These people didn't. They wanted to leave it and form their own church, and that's why they're going to be known as separatists. So so as time goes on, there was Henry VIII, and then there was Mary, and then, well, there was Edward, then Mary, then Elizabeth, and then it goes to James the First. James the First, actually, his mother was Catholic, and he comes in and he's head of the Presbyterian Church, but now he's head of the Anglican Church, and he believes in divine right of kings, and if you go against him, you go against the church, you're going against him, you're going against God. He also approved the translation of the Bible into English, and so that's where we get King James's Bible. He also established some close ties with Spain, which concerned a lot of people because they were trying to get away from Catholicism. So these people, these Puritans, now Pilgrims, they believed in the teachings of John Calvin, who we're going to talk about in a minute. They left England and they went to the Netherlands. And let's look at, I think the next slide tells you about that. Oh, but anyway, here's some of the teachings of John Calvin, right? He was a Swiss theologian, brilliant guy. He believed that something was lost in translation from the Bible when you look at it in, vernaculars, when you look at it in English or other languages. And so he learned Greek and Hebrew and Latin, and he went and he studied the Bible that way. And he took from it the original intent in his interpretation. He says, man is dead unless you have this conversion, this deep, overwhelming emotional sense of feeling God's presence. They call it nowadays as a born again Christian. It just kind of overcomes you and you feel this way. He also believed in the notion of predestination. He said that only God alone can determine who is chosen for salvation. You're predestined for either salvation or damnation, right? And salvation could only be achieved, by God's good grace. It wasn't through confessionals or doing penance or anything like that. So it couldn't be achieved through good works either. God just chose either you are or you're not, right? Some other beliefs, they didn't like the sign of the cross, the Trinity. They didn't believe in stained glass. They thought all of these ornamental things went outside of the realm of the original intent of the teachings of Jesus Christ. So a lot of the Puritans at this time followed the teachings and the beliefs of John Calvin, and so it did not coincide with the Anglican Church at all. All right, so anyway, the Pilgrims, as I started to say earlier, they first moved from Scooby in England, and then they went to the Netherlands. Now, the Netherlands has this open society, and they thought that it was a little bit too liberal for their liking, and it was inappropriately influencing the young within their congregation, and they felt as if they were losing their own identity. So they decided to move and establish themselves in North America. So they got a charter with the Virginia Company to establish themselves at the mouth of the Hudson River. Now, those of you who know your geography, you may know that that is New York City, and that's a long way, sort of, from Cape Cod, where they ended up settling. So if you look right there, you can see on the map where the Virginia Company's northern boundary was, and then also this would have been where they originally intended to settle, but then they ended up here at what would become Plymouth, right? So on the ship, the Mayflower, there's a group of passengers, most of whom are not Puritans, and they're not within the land of the Virginia territory, the Virginia Company territory. So there's unrest on the ship before they even disembark, because it's like, okay, we're not privy to, we don't have to abide by these laws, English laws, and some people thought that the Puritans would kind of dominate. And so what they did to kind of quiet this uneasiness on the ship is they drafted up this agreement, which became known as the Mayflower Compact, right? Uh, so, and you can see this, it's set about at the very bottom here, an agreement by the majority, there would be majority rule for establishing the foundation for their democratic government. And this kind of would lead to, you know, we're just going to rule on what is the best case for everybody. And that kind of started town hall meetings, which is still a tradition in that part of New England today. Okay, so the longtime governor of Plymouth Colony is William Bradford. Bradford kind of led them. He was a religious and spiritual leader, but not a member of the clergy. He's going to function as the head of their government. They also had on board somebody who was not a Puritan, Miles Standish, and he was their chief sort of military officer. But anyway, they land in December of 1620 in the winter. Doesn't make much sense to me. And they established this town, and the town was on a Wampanoag community already. But years before, a plague had come through and killed all of the people there. But it was a good location. There was a lot of water. It was a good harbor. Fields had already been cleared. There was corn had been growing in them. Of course, it was December. So anyway, they decided to make their settlement there. But that first winter was really rough. There was disease. It was cold. The disease probably was scurvy and then pneumonia. So they weren't getting the right nutrients. A lot of their food was overly salty. They had a lot of food on board on ship, but it was the wrong kind of food, and so they had scurvy. So there was a duration, a period there of like 2 months where about 2 to 3 people were dying every day. So it's really rough. It's almost as bad as Jamestown, except they never resorted to eating one another, right? So anyway, they're there in the spring, and the Mayflower departs. So they really have no choice but to stick it out. William Bradford, the guy in the statue right here, he is elected their governor in April, right? And he remains in a leadership position one way or another, usually as governor for 30 years. He's going to write, and you may read this in Comp on of Plymouth Plantation, and he really gives a good account of the events that took place in Plymouth. Okay, one of the things that saved them was their relationship with the Native Americans. So there are a couple of Native Americans who helped them. Probably the most noted is Squanto. But anyway, they settle near the Wampanoag Indians, and one leader who comes to them is Massasoit. At least that's what the Pilgrims call him. It should be N parentheses after Massasoit there. So they come there, and the Massasoit's smart. He thinks that he can acquire things from them They have weapons, right? They have different things that the Indians want. They didn't want to have any harm come to them or to the Indians. And so they kind of come to this agreement where they're going to work together. Squanto, this Wampanoag Indian man who had been captured years before and imprisoned and somehow got free. He was in Europe. He learned English. He got free. He came back. He found his family dead. But he comes and instructs them on how to plant corn and how to survive in Massachusetts, I guess, wilderness, right? So that was very helpful to them. So that 1621 is going to be better than the winter of 2021. All right, so because after that first year, they do have a bountiful harvest. So what they do is they get together with the Native Americans, Massasoit, about 90 of his men and some others get together and they have this 3-day celebration with lots of food and giving thanks, right? And this was nothing new. This is something that the Indians did anyway. So they get around and they solidify their bond and they have the first Thanksgiving. Accustomed to doing, there's a typo in there, sorry about that. But Thanksgiving never became a holiday until the height of the Civil War, right? It was 1863. Abraham Lincoln, my love, he creates Thanksgiving as a holiday to try to unite the American people, look to our history, look to our past, that sort of thing. And so that is now a national holiday. Okay, so if you look at this right here, you can see that where the colonists settled there at Plymouth, there's the Wampanoag, there's the Narragansett, the Pequot, the Massachusetts, all these indigenous tribes that were located there, including the Pequot. And the Pequot are an enemy of the Wampanoag and the Narragansett and others. A lot of people envy the Pequot because they have the source of wealth in the region, which is wampum. All right, so 10 years go by. Everything's kind of evolving in Plymouth and then also in Jamestown, but then we get another colony, and this is Massachusetts Bay Colony. So Massachusetts Bay Colony was established by a joint stock company, which is Massachusetts Bay Company, right? So what happened, there was a group of wealthy Puritans, and they kind of got together and they organized this to where they could sell out and do this. They're not separatists, they're Puritans. They wanted to remain members of the Church of England. They just didn't want to be persecuted, right? So they get a grant of land from the Council of New England, and they were supposed to go in there, or the Council of New England, from the Merrimack River all the way down actually all the way to the west, the Pacific Ocean. So they got all of this territory, right? This was a charter that they were supposed to have. And it was reinforced by the king, but the king was kind of misled as to who was actually doing this and what was the point. Somehow, though, even though this thing started, the Puritans were able to get like the controlling interest of it. And so they're the ones who come out. There's like 1,000 people on 12 ships, and they land in Boston Harbor in 1630. Right? So the religious leader of the group is a man by, well, actually, he's going to be the political leader, but he's also their spiritual leader. His name is John Winthrop. And he brings everybody together and he gives this speech. He wanted the colony to be a model of Christian charity. He wanted to set an example for the rest of the world of what a Protestant Christian community could be like, right? They really believed that they had God's divine right to do what they were going to do. The first year was rough. They lost about 200 people, but then their numbers kept growing and growing in what would become known as the Great Migration, and this happened from 1630 to 1642, as you can see here on the slide. There are two great migrations in U.S. history. One is all of these guys coming over, and then the other one is when Black people moved up out of the South following World War II. That was a massive migration as well, and that's known also as a Great Migration. Okay, so this right here is John Winthrop, and he delivers this speech. You guys had to do this as a primary source quiz, but it's in our mutual consent that we seek out a place of cohabitation and consortship under a due form of government, both civil and ecclesiastical, meaning religious. In such cases as this, the care of the public must oversway all private respects. That's what he told them. And he goes, because you're supposed to work as a community and be brothers in the community and help one another out. And the famous line that politicians have restated over and over again is, we shall be a city upon a hill, meaning we're going to set an example for the rest of civilization. Okay, so this right here, you see the waves of people leaving England and just migrating to the Americas. Notice the large number of people that go to the Caribbean, right? And then a small number are going to England, but nonetheless, or to New England. Nonetheless, a lot of people are leaving England and coming to the Americas. It's right before the English Civil War. There's a lot of conflict that's taking place, and so people want to skedaddle and get out of there. Right. So anyway, what happens in this area between Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay and Massachusetts really is that we do get this Bible Commonwealth. It's a very spiritual, very religious, very strict Puritan society that emerges there. What they have, rather than calling it the Anglican Church, they call it the Congregational Church, right? Women and those who were not members of the church did not have a vote, but about 2/5 of the male did, which was actually a higher percentage or portion than what they had in England at that time. They resorted right away to self-government. They had those town meetings that I was telling you about. All property-owning men had the chance to vote. However, Jonathan Winthrop thought that democracy was a bad thing, because if you get democracy, then people would be more willing to, um, not have willpower to do what the easiest thing rather than the right thing. And so he feared a breakdown of society if you had democracy, right? So anyway, these religious leaders had a lot of influence, but what you're going to see is there is also separation between church and state, because even though religion was an important part of their society, the the religious leaders were not supposed to have a leadership role in politics, right? So that was supposed to be separate. They also had this sort of Protestant work ethic. So the way that they got around predestination, the notion of being fearful that you were or were not destined for salvation, was that if you were an upstanding citizen, if you were a hard worker, if you acquired wealth, those sorts of things, then theoretically you were chosen for salvation, so you were predestined. And so we get what's known as the Protestant work ethic, which some historians argue became kind of ingrained within the American character. And we are known for being really hard workers, at least most of us, some of us. Anyway, but anyway, their life, was actually, it ran pretty smoothly for them. They embraced their ideas. They worked and they had worldly pursuit. And you can see on here, they ate plentiful, they drank, they sang, they loved monogamously. So you had single partner. There were also these blue laws, right? So those were against things like drinking. And so even today, like in Virginia, there's blue laws where you can't buy alcohol except if it's controlled by the state. So you have to go to what's known as an ABC store. And then, of course, they do have this really real fear of hell, right? That they're going to go to hell. And so they want to live an upstanding life so that they don't suffer eternal damnation. All right, let's go back to the Chesapeake and see how it's developing now too. So we've got up in New England, they've kind of established themselves on the basis of religion. Remember, in the Chesapeake, people are looking for wealth, right? And the main wealth that they found was tobacco. Right. But then we get Maryland too. Maryland was established as a haven for Catholics, and this was granted by Charles I, who was the son of James I, to someone who was loyal to him, and that was the first Lord Baltimore, George Calvert. It's because he had been loyal to the crown, and a lot of times they dote out land like that to people. They gave that sort of thing. So this becomes the first proprietary colony where you have an owner of it, right? Somebody owns it, and then they establish self-government too. And as I said, it was supposed to be a haven for Catholics, and these proprietors granted out all these huge tracts of land that were supposed to be estates for the wealthy, but then they had to also, they wanted to let others in to be workers. And so other people start coming in, and you had these laborers or these small farmers next to these great big estates, right? And then pretty soon you're going to have the majority of people there who are Protestant and not Catholic, and it's going to create tension. All right. So what we get, these land barons, as I said, they establish their estates, right? But then the settlers have land, and then we have more Protestants than we do have Catholics, and so there's a little bit of an uprising because the Protestants feel as if they feel as if they're not going to be able to practice their religion, and so what we get is the Act of Toleration, which said that anybody who is Christian can practice their religion freely. However, if you didn't believe in Jesus Christ, then you could be killed, right? So really, there was less religious freedom after the act of the so-called toleration than there was before. All right, so here is the act of toleration right here. You can read it down at the bottom here. Well, I'll read the whole thing. People shall from henceforth upon any occasion or offense, otherwise in a reproachful manner or way, declare, call, or denounce any person or persons whatsoever inhabiting, residing, trafficking, trading, or commencing within this province or within any port, harbors, creeks, havens to the same belonging heretic, schismatic, adulterer, Puritan, Independent, Presbyterian, Antinomian, Barrowist, Roundhead, Separatist, Popist, Priest, Jesuit, Papist, Lutheran, all of these are Christian, right? Or any name in reproachful manner, you can't persecute them at all. Then you're going to be in trouble, right? And lose 10 shillings. But then down here at the bottom, and if they could not pay, they were to be publicly whipped and imprisoned without bail. And then, of course, I don't have the part where they're going to be killed if you're anything other than a person who believed in Jesus Christ. So that's the act of toleration. All right, in the Chesapeake, there is a high demand for labor, and so what they do is they have indentured servants, and these indentured servants, they kind of they sign a contract to where they agree to come to America to work for 5 to 7 years for somebody else, and then afterwards you're supposed to get these freedom dues, which are land and money. And so a lot of people come by 10,000 by 1700, but only 1 in 10 outlived their contract, right? So 90% of them died between the years 1610 and 1614. Then what the Virginia Company started to do was give people 50 acres of land for every person that they brought over because labor was in such short supply and people really wanted that land, so that worked as well. And then we start to see slavery, and that's a process that starts growing, or this institution, following the first slaves being brought to Jamestown in 1619, which we already talked about. So that starts to grow. There were only 400 slaves in Virginia in 1650, but that number is going to rapidly increase following Bacon's Rebellion. Okay, so Bacon's Rebellion, that happened when Nathaniel Bacon, who is pictured up here on the top, he was an impoverished gentleman farmer, and he's out on the frontier, as are a lot of people who may be former indentured servants, that sort of thing. They move out further west, still east of the Appalachian Mountains, but they're going out there and they're coming into contact with the Native Americans. Now, the guy at the bottom, that's Sir William Berkeley, and you can see it's explained up there. He was a longtime governor of Virginia, and he really ruled like a tyrant, right? And he had the inside track on trading furs with the Native Americans. And so he didn't want anything to hinder the business that he got because it was very, very lucrative. So anyway, when there were attacks by Native Americans on settlers, white settlers out in the frontier, Berkeley wouldn't do anything. And Nathaniel Bacon, he got a uprising started where people went and they attacked like 1,000 Virginians, and they rebelled against the governor. They go to Jamestown, they burn the Capitol, but it didn't go anywhere. It just died right then because Bacon gets sick. He dies of dysentery. A lot of the people in the rebellion were captured and killed. So it was, I don't know, something like 20 to 40 of them were killed as a result of this. But there had a lasting mark on Virginia as a result of that. If you look right here, in the years following that, and that was 1676, the number of slaves increases quite a bit. The elites turn to slaves because slaves are more reliable. You don't have to treat them as English citizens. They don't have all of these rights, right? And so there's going to be a push. A lot of these people, these slave owners, or a lot of these plantation owners, want to get slaves instead of indentured servants, and so the number increases. All right, so let's go look at the development of New England, leave the Chesapeake, go back up the East Coast to New England. All right, so some certain characteristics is that religion, especially Puritan form of it, was an integral part of the New England society, right? The government was almost functioned like a theocracy. A theocracy, and you can see this this term right here. A theocracy, well, not there, this term right here. A theocracy is of or having to do with religion. The religion kind of runs the government. If you look in the Mideast, a lot of countries are like that. Saudi Arabia kind of has a theocracy, even though they have a king. Iraq does because the mullahs are in charge, right? But anyway, these leaders in the New England community believed that they had power given to them by God, right? And they thought they had all of this authority. And what they wanted was religious conformity. They didn't want freedom of thought. You were supposed to think the same way that they did, right? So anyway, all these laws assume that citizens who strayed from the conventional way of thinking, they were a threat to the order of their community. And that would either mean other Christians like Baptists or Quakers. And if anybody went against them, they were banished. They were kicked out of their society. And there's going to be a couple specifically of note. Right? One of them is Roger Williams. You had to read an excerpt, The Tenant of Bloody Persecution, right? But anyway, he started preaching. He believed that, the government shouldn't control your thoughts, that it wasn't up to them, so that you should have freedom of religion and freedom of thought. And so he ordered, he wanted a full break from the Anglican Church, and he criticized also the fact that the government of Massachusetts had come in and taken the land and not purchased it from the Indians. Well, he was banished because of these beliefs, and he goes down to Rhode Island and he buys the land from the Indians and he establishes a colony free from religious persecution. So you were free to be a practicing Catholic or Quaker or Jew. It didn't really matter. So you had freedom of religion. All right, another person who was banished was Anne Hutchinson. She was a woman who led a group of people in like a Bible study, and she had a lot of authority, and she started, speaking out with her interpretations of everything. One of the things that she said is, if there's such a thing as predestination, it doesn't matter how I act on this earth. I can, I'm still going to go to heaven. or I'm going to go to hell. You know, I don't have to be good and I can be bad. It doesn't matter. Right. Well, a lot of people, that was a little bit too much for them to take, aside from the fact, too, that she was a woman. She challenged the authority of the church. And because she said she had had a direct revelation from God. So that was a little bit too much for people to take. The main thing that she was found guilty on was antinomianism, right? Which goes against, you're arguing against the rules, the laws, and that sort of thing. She was a very strong willed, independent woman, and she had a following. So she and her following, her husband and all her children, I think she had like 14 of them, they decided to establish their own colony. So they went down, forget where they went, and I can't see because my head's in the way. But they end up in New York, where she was killed by Native Americans in an uprising that took place there. Okay, other people left the Massachusetts Bay Colony too, and they went to establish other colonies, sometimes because they felt as if they were too religious at Massachusetts Bay Colony, or because they weren't religious enough. So in Hartford, the Reverend Thomas Hooker, he goes with some of his followers in 1636, and they create Connecticut, right? They draft up some laws, and also they draft up a plan of government known as the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, which establish a representative government, and it is seen as our nation's first written constitution, right? Because it also established a legislative branch, right? And with this legislative branch, it was chosen by the people, and then the governor was chosen by the legislators. So it's really kind of cool. And then in New Haven, they were more democratic there than in Massachusetts Bay, and they were granted a charter of their own by the king. So they went off and established themselves there too. As you know, Hartford is now a town, and New Haven is now a town, both of them in Connecticut. All right, so you can kind of see where New Haven is, and you can see where Hartford was located, and also Rhode Island. So we've got Massachusetts, Virginia, Maryland, Rhode Island, and Connecticut. All right, so as more and more Indians come into the region, there's going to be competition among each group to compete, to trade with the English, right? And there's kind of conflict between them. And so this is a conflict, and you can click on, I don't know if you can, the link here, maybe not. I'll post it. But anyway, there was a war that broke out known as the Pequot War. Now, the Pequot were located down in this area right here. And the thing about the Pequot is they were sitting pretty because they had access, and they made the wampum. The wampum are beads that are made from seashells in the area, and that's what they had in that area. And then you would string them together, and you would have belts and that sort of thing. They were highly prized, and oftentimes they like told the story of your family or something like that. So they have this. So anyway, the English come together with some other tribes, uh, and what they do is they attack. There's a war that goes on between 1636 and 1637 with the Pequot. But then one night, the English and their native allies, they surround the encampment of this one Pequot village, and they burn it to the ground. And while people are trying to escape, they just shoot them, men, women, and children. So it was pretty horrendous what happened to the Pequot. Okay, here on the left, that's an image of the wampum, right? These are the beads that are strung together. And then on the right, this is an image of the Pequot village. It's surrounded all the way around by Indians and their English allies. Oops, sorry, Lucy. And then this right here, okay? This right here, that you can see the fence that kind of goes all the way around too, and there's different openings. And as people tried to get out, they were shot. And then what they did is they just started burning them. So it was basically a massacre of the Pequot. All right, and then we're going to get New Hampshire. If you go up north, this had been a small fishing village, but Charles II separates it in 1679 and it becomes a royal colony, and then a governor was appointed. They don't get a lot of people in there, and they still don't have a lot of people. And it remains kind of small port until the Revolutionary War. Right, changing life in New England as we get 2, 3 generations of people there, things start to change. Younger couples are forced to move further out or into different communities, and so they're not as tight knit as they once were. You have people who do not have the conversions, and so you can't be a member of the church unless you've had a conversion. So their numbers were kind of dwindling. So what the church leadership decided to do was offer the halfway covenant. They said that you can become a member of the church if your parents are a member of the church, even if you haven't yet had a conversion. Now there are the more conservative or ministers who reject that, right? Then they said they reject it because they said that their practices were weakening, and so was their society and that sort of thing. On the right is an image of the town Sudbury, Massachusetts, and you can see all these people who have their little houses in a row, and it's lining up against the Boston Commons, and that would be a common ground where people could go maybe as pasture land, and then you would go and work different fields outside of town. So that's how the New England communities were structured at this time. Okay, they also, one place that was very important was the meeting house. It served as a meeting house, so a government place, and then also as the church. And you can see it here. Their churches did not have steeples at that time. A lot of them were tax funded, right, up until the Revolutionary period. And then we get separation of church and state, and they're not tax funded. Okay, so as time progresses and we get all of these other colonies, New Hampshire, Massachusetts and Plymouth are going to join together. And then you have New Haven and Hartford, they're going to join together too, and Connecticut. And what they do is they join together into this sort of alliance known as a New England Confederation. And they do that for, you can see for what is that, like 40 years. One reason for that, and of course they don't allow Rhode Island in because that's the sewer where Roger Williams is and all of his outcasts, according to them. But anyway, this is as a defensive measure against Native Americans, also against the French who are to their north and the Dutch who are down in New York. So this is the way to kind of buffer up their defenses against that. And then also they work together to settle different boundary disputes and everything else. The people who controlled it, though, were the Puritans. Each colony got 2 votes. After the Restoration, though, Charles II gave the legality to Connecticut and Rhode Island, but took away the charter of Massachusetts. So once he did that, too, the Puritans didn't have very much say. And other people start to kind of come into their community and the piety starts to wane. Piety means their religiousness. All right, then though, we're going to get another war that takes place with the Native Americans there. And this one's really serious. It's known as King Philip's War. Now, do you remember Massasoit? Massasoit was the Indian who welcomed them there, at Plymouth when they came at the Mayflower and joined in. Well, it was his son who's named Metacom. Metacom just saw that there was just this huge number of people coming, and he wanted to fight against that onslaught. So this was a pan-Indian sort of effort to stop the advance of the English. And so what they did is they coordinated all these attacks simultaneously throughout New England. And they attacked throughout the frontier. A lot of people go and they retreat to Boston. Eventually the Pilgrims were, well, actually not the Pilgrims, but the English were able to mount counterattacks. They capture King Philip and his family. They defeat the army. King Philip's family is sold into slavery. King Philip is drawn and quartered His head was severed and it was put on a stick and placed outside the village for all to see for years to come. After this, this was the last significant attack by the Native Americans against the English in New England. All right, so let's go down to the restoration colonies. You're going to have to understand what the restoration is to understand the restoration colonies. Okay, so the restoration occurred when this guy, Charles II, was returned in his family, the Stuarts, to the throne of England. So what had happened, there was the English Civil War that had broken out, and during 11 years, there was this interim government where the royal family was opposed. As a matter of fact, Charles I was captured and he was tried and he was executed in 1649. Charles I's son, Charles II, who is this guy right here, he went into exile in France, but then following the death of Oliver Cromwell was the leader of this movement that led the Protestant Reformation, you could say, in England. They ruled the government strictly in a puritanistic sort of way. And then Oliver Cromwell died. But then because of, after his death, his son was put in and his son was ineffective. And people were really resentful of the way that Oliver Cromwell had ruled. So they allowed James II to return to the throne, but he had to promise that he would grant amnesty to his opponents, which he did. However, they dug up Oliver Cromwell's body and opened up the tomb, took him out, and then they hung him from the gallows, right? But what Charles does then, Charles II, is he goes about rewarding those people who had been supportive of him during that time with huge land grants, right? He was going to give them land grants. All right, so one of them was South Carolina, and originally South Carolina, its economy was based on growing food for the people, the English colonists in the West Indies, so in the Caribbean, because all they're producing was sugar. So they needed to have food stuff, right? So they did that. Now, the Carolinas are named after King Charles because Carolina or Carolinian is Latin for Charles. And so that's where we get that. And in South Carolina, there is Charleston, right? It's Charlestown. But anyway, he awards a lot of land to some of his followers, and they create these huge plantations, and they start to grow, instead of just food stuff for the West Indies, they start to produce indigo and rice. That's my dog. She's chewing on an antler. Sorry for that noise. And then they needed labor, and this was after Bacon's rebellion too. So what they do is, stop it, Lucy. They start to rely on slave labor. So at this time, more Africans were brought in. They're more reliable than the English. They're much more reliable than the English, right? They don't have to be treated as British citizens. They're not going to rise up as what happened with Bacon's rebellion. It's not as easy for Africans to escape into the interior, and they're easy to spot if they do, because they're not white, right? Because of the color of their skin, and because they have a resistance to malaria. Another thing too is many people from Africa, or a lot of the slaves, knew how to cultivate the rice, right? So we get this rich aristocratic class that develops in South Carolina, and then Charleston also develops as this aristocratic city with a very busy seaport in the South. There really aren't good ports in the South, but Charleston is one of them. It also attracted other people to the area, including French Huguenots, which were the equivalent to English Protestants. So they're coming as well. The only problem with it is where it was located is the southernmost colony at that time, because Georgia hasn't been established. It's not going to be until 1733. It was subject to Spanish raids, and also slaves, if they escaped, they would go into Spanish Florida, right? So then that was problematic for them in South Carolina. All right, then North Carolina, it separates from South Carolina in 1691, and it's quite different than its southern rich neighbor, distant cousin. They develop quite differently. They don't have good transportation links, and that's what you needed for these big plantations to be self-sufficient. And they just didn't have that in North Carolina. So instead of having these huge plantations, they're going to have these small self-sustaining tobacco farms, right? These people just started going in there and then just squatting on the land, and most of them were poverty-stricken outcasts, quite different from the aristocratic elite of South Carolina. But they had this resistance spirit about them, and they fight with the Native Americans and they drive them out. Those are the Tuscarora, who end up going and joining the Iroquois Confederation of New York. So they go quite a bit further north. They start, though, to produce other things than besides tobacco. Turpentine, tar, pitch, these are naval stores. And then other things too. There's a lot of pine trees there. Because of the tar, they got the name Tar Hills, right? And so even today that's carried through. Right, another one, another restoration colony besides South Carolina and North Carolina is New York. Now, this area had been colonized or settled by the Dutch in the area there that is blue along the Hudson River. It's named after Henry Hudson, who was commissioned by I guess it was the king of the Netherlands, right, to go and see if they could find a northwest passage to Asia. So Henry Hudson skirts along Cape Cod. He goes and discovers that river right there. He also later came back and he went into what is now known as Hudson Bay, but his crew mutinied on him there, kicked him off the boat without a gun or any food, and all the other misfits on the boat and just set them about. So probably Henry Hudson is somewhere at the bottom of Hudson Bay. I don't know. But it was named after him. So the Dutch established themselves there mostly as a trading center with the Indians for furs, right? So they established themselves at New York, which is New Amsterdam, at the bottom of the Hudson River, at the mouth of the Hudson River. But then they kind of consolidate. They go up the river and they bring people in because they want to diversify what they are producing, right? They wanted to do more than just export furs. And so what we're going to get is this national stock company, which is the Dutch West India Company, and 30 families come in and put these estates up the river, and they try to extract other resources that then they send to Holland, right, the Netherlands. All right, this is super cool. This is an artist depiction of what New York would have looked like when they first colonized it there, when Europeans first came and saw it. The Lenape Indians were there, and the Dutch historically bought the land from this Native American group for like 25 bucks. It was 60 guilders, right? So now you can't even and ride the subway for a week for that there. But they do establish this trading company and they strengthen, if you see on the left there, that goes up, actually Manhattan's an island. So it goes up there, the Hudson River. But they do diversify and they're extracting all sorts of natural resources, still mostly fur, but also trees and other things as well. And New York has a wonderful port. They already have at New Netherlands, or New Amsterdam, excuse me, a very vibrant city with a very diverse population. New York has always been that way. All right, then if you look down here, this is New Sweden on the banks of the Delaware River, right there between what is today New Jersey, Delaware, Pennsylvania, and Maryland. So the Swedes came and established themselves there in 1610. But they established on land that the Dutch had claimed. So the Dutch governor up in New Netherlands, Peter Stuyvesant, he leads a military expedition down there and expels the Swedes, which is interesting because the English are going to come and expel Peter Stuyvesant, right? So anyway, they're conquered by the Dutch Republic in 1655. All right, then the King of England, Charles II, he wants to consolidate their holdings in New England with those down in the Chesapeake and feels they need to take that area that has been claimed by the Dutch and previously the Swedes. So he grants this land to his brother, James II, who is the Duke of York. Well, James, right away, he renames it New York and he sends a military expedition out there to go and take it from the Dutch. And so they go to Peter Stuyvesant, and Stuyvesant just steps aside and he allows the English to come in without any bloodshed. And so the English then have it. James, surprisingly, allows the Dutch-speaking people to remain there, practice their religion, and speak their language. What he wants to do, though, is not grant them the right to self-government, but there's a lot of protest there, especially among the English citizens who had migrated to the region, and so he gives in and he allows self-government. All colonies had self-government. All right, then we get New Jersey. Now, New Jersey was also land that was bequeathed to others as part of the Restoration. He divides New York to better govern it and administer it. James does, once James becomes, well, James does, and then also when he's king, he does that. So this is the land between the Hudson River and the Delaware Bay. He granted to two of his friends, right, and they were supposed to administer it. So that's John Berkeley and George Cartier, right? So they grant religious freedom to all of the settlers if you're Catholic or Christian, right? And then you get land granted to you in exchange for this annual fee that you have to pay. But people weren't paying their fee, and so it was very expensive. So Berkeley sold his half to the Quakers, right? And then the land was divided. And then in 1702, the two Jerseys were consolidated into what is now New Jersey. All right, and then we get Pennsylvania. So this guy right here is William Penn. His father, Sir William Penn, died in 1670, but the crown was deeply in debt to him, and so what they did is grant the land of Pennsylvania to William Penn. William Penn was a Quaker. The Quakers believe in Jesus Christ, but they also believe in equality for all people, men and women, Native Americans. I'm pretty sure African Americans too. That's one of the first colonies to outlaw slavery. There's resistance to military service, and there was no religious authority, not in the king, not in your ministers or anything like that. It was only within yourself and your soul. And so a lot of people didn't trust the Quakers. Right, so what they do, they set about creating this colony known as the Holy Experiment, right? So it was there, it was supposed to be a refuge for Quakers. They had been persecuted throughout England and the Americas. So they set up this framework for government, representative assembly, and that would be elected by the landowners. They had a written constitution known as the Charter of Liberties, and there everybody got religious freedom. And they had unlimited immigration. As a matter of fact, they wrote up flyers advertising, trying to get people to come to Pennsylvania to recruit these settlers. William Penn himself, he oversaw the building of Philadelphia. By the way, Pennsylvania means Penn's wood, right? And like Roger Williams, he purchased the land, and the Dutch, he purchased the land from the Native Americans. All right, and then there's Delaware. Penn granted this lower part. There were three, I think more counties than colonies. There were three lower counties of Pennsylvania that had these independent assemblies, and it became a separate colony in 1732. But there was the same governor there, but they had their own representative assemblies. And a lot of people who came there were of Protestant faiths, including the Scotch-Irish, who were Methodists, or the Presbyterians, and then also Methodists who were English, who came later. Okay, and then Georgia, the final colony, that was established in 1732, and there were two main reasons. One, there was going to be a buffer between South Carolina and Spanish Florida. And then the other reason is because it was going to be a haven for debtors. So people who were in debt in England, rather than going to prison or anything like that, you're going to work yourself out of it here. This colony was directly supervised by the British government, but there was a philanthropist by the name of James Oglethorpe who founded Savannah in 1733, and he acted as the governor. They had some pretty harsh rules, though, for some people at the time to abide by. There was no alcohol, no rum or anything like that, and no slavery. So for the longest time, it was difficult to work the land without slaves, and people had come to depend upon slaves in this agrarian society, and so a lot of people didn't go there when they could go to South Carolina or North Carolina. It became a royal colony in 1752. It didn't really prosper. Eventually, the restrictions were lifted, and slowly it began to grow. Okay, the last thing we're really going to talk about is mercantilism and this economic system that existed between England, the mother country, and its colonies. All right, so mercantilism, as I said, it is this economic policy of imperial powers where they trade for the benefit of the mother colony, right? It's the belief that all of your wealth was the basis of a nation's military and political strength. And so you're going to build this wealth. Government's going to regulate your trade. It's going to regulate production. The colonies only existed to enrich the mother country. That's what they were all about. So to make it to where this worked, they enforced these acts, or actually they passed these acts. They didn't really enforce them. They're known as the Navigation Acts, and they were put in place between 1650 and 1673. So it said here, any trade between to and from the colonies could be operated only by English or colonial crews on English or colonial built ships, right? So you can't do it on French ships or anything else. All imports to the colonies had to go through England first, and it specified that certain products could only go to England, and the main enumerated product was tobacco, which of course was the main thing that the colonies produced at that time. All right, so the impact there were some benefits, but then there were some negative aspects as well. It does cause the growth of shipbuilding in New England, right? Along with the other things that they need, like, and maybe not just in New England, like down in North Carolina, naval stores, tar and pitch. Also, there were British troops that were placed there to protect them against attack from the French or the Spanish or the Native Americans. And the Chesapeake Bay had this monopoly on trading tobacco with England, and so England wouldn't get it from anywhere else. But the negative things was that it really it hindered colonial manufacturing, even though manufacturing really wasn't going to take off for probably about another get the cotton gin in 1793, and then we start to develop after the revolution, right? It did force farmers to accept low prices for their products. It caused some of them to pay high prices for these finished goods that they could only get from England. And there's a resentment that built up for England making these laws on them, so people just didn't abide by them. What we have found historically, if Americans don't like a law, they just don't abide by it. Right. So anyway, the enforcement of these navigation acts, the British government, they put them in place, but they didn't really enforce them for a number of reasons. It was very difficult to do that. It was very expensive to do that. You had a lot of ships out there, a lot of troops, and everything else. And it was really inconsistent up until 1763, and that's after the French and Indian War. Then they start to enforce them. That's where the problem lies, right? They hadn't enforced them for a long time, and then after the French and Indian War, which we're going to get to in the next chapter, they do, and Americans are not having it. All right, so some other things that they do, England does, that ticks off the colonists, is they create the Dominion of New England. This was during the reign of James II, after Charles II had died. James puts together parts of New York, New Jersey, and all of New England to be governed collectively. He combined all of these colonies into one government with one governor, and they appoint this guy Edmund Andros to run things. He's the governor of the Dominion of New England. So that meant that these people really didn't have a say with their colonial legislatures, and they're getting mad because this guy's leveling taxes, he's limiting town meetings, and revokes land titles and grants that people had worked on their land for a long time, and then all of a sudden they're losing it. So these people are upset by this, but what do? You wait for the glorious revolution. They didn't know it was coming, but it did. So anyway, it looked like James II was going to suffer the same fate as his father. He was marrying a Catholic woman from Spain. He had developed close relationship with them. He had dissolved Parliament, and he did all of these things to tick off just about everybody in British government, right? And so it looked like there was going to be another revolt against him. People were talking about it. They put out fillers. Mary, his daughter, was married to, I guess, the Prince of Orange. She was like um, the king of the Netherlands, right, of Holland. His name was William, and Mary, his daughter, was married to him. And so they offered William the throne. So William sends a force in there. James had brought these people up to fight against him, but they all kind of chickened out. And so William and Mary rule as joint monarchs. And to do that, Parliament required that they sign off on the English Bill of Rights. At that point in England, there's a shift from the power. The king or queen no longer has more power. It's Parliament who has power, and the people through this Bill of Rights. Okay, so the impact is that people kind of celebrated that here. They revolted here too. Protestants were freed from regulations placed against them by James II. There was a Boston revolt where the mob descends on Edmund Andros and oust him. Right. Then there's Leisler's rebellion in New York, because remember, New York and Massachusetts were all under Edmund Randall or Andros. And so this guy, Jacob Leisler, he says, no, I'm going to be the governor here. He ousted him thinking that he was like this hero. He's an ardent Protestant, and he overthrew the governor, names himself governor. But when William and Mary become king and queen, they send the new governor out there, and Leisler was imprisoned, and then he was killed for treason. Right? There's also the revolt that takes place in Maryland. The Protestants rise up and rebel against Catholic government. And at this time, then Maryland is no longer a proprietary colony. It becomes a royal colony. And the policies of mercantilism were enforced more, and there were more English officials placed there. So this is all after the Glorious Revolution. All right, there's also an increased demand for slaves, and the reason for that is because fewer people were coming after the Civil War was over. Fewer people were coming from England, and they wanted a more dependable workforce, as I told you before. Africans were more immune to the diseases. They were more manageable. You didn't have to give them the same rights as British citizens, and it got cheaper because the Royal African Company lost its monopoly on the importation of slaves. So they start coming in more and more at a time, right? By 1750, half the population of Virginia was slaves, and it made up the majority of the population in South Carolina. All right, as the slaves come in, as you know, because you've read these Virginia slavery statutes, these are known as the slave laws. They got more and more stringent as time went on. Initially, the status of a slave wasn't really certain. It was more like an indentured servant, but as time went on, it was more strict. Even if you're a Christian, it didn't matter. Also, if you were born to a slave woman, then you were a slave for life. You were chattel, right? So this is a transatlantic slave trade. Where slaves were extracted from Africa. We've watched a video on this. We've read some things from this too. It begins 336 years of the slave trade. We talked about this when we go back to 1619 at the previous part of this presentation. But anyway, this is going to last, of course, in the United States until the American Civil War. It started by the Portuguese and the Spanish, but then it expanded to other countries in Europe. At one point, 90% of all laborers in Brazil were slaves that were brought from Africa. Right, and they were brought in this pattern because of how the trade winds functioned, and so we're going to get something known as the triangular trade route, well, let's look at it here. Okay, oh, the source of slaves would be right here, the Bight of Benin, the Gold Coast, the West Central Africa. It's a very vast area with many different ethnic groups, a lot of different languages and everything else. Most of the people who were brought were extracted from within 150 miles of the coast. They were forced marched to the coast where they were put into these slave forts, and then they had to endure that horrible middle passage across the transatlantic, right? Oftentimes they were purchased from slave traders for guns, gunpowder, rum, textiles, trinkets, all sorts of things. Right, so here, this is the middle passage. They were marched 2 by 2 down into the hull of the ship and placed as tight sometimes. Some packers or some traders would put them as tight as possibly could, believing the more slaves, the better. Others thought, well, we're going to give them some space because then more will survive the passage. So it just depended on what their attitude was. But it was under horrible conditions, very little food. You're fed twice a day, just a few rations. It was a month-long trip that you were stuck down into the holes of the bottoms of the bowels of these ships, right? There was disease, starvation, killed them if they acted up, rape, suicide, all sorts of terrible things. About 1.5 million of the estimated 12 million people who were extracted died along the way, and some reports that sharks followed the ships across the ocean. All right, so what develops is this system known as triangular trade. You can see it going in 2 directions, right? Sometimes to Europe, sometimes directly from, you can see it going from New England down to Africa. They would take rum there. They would trade the rum for the African slaves. They'd take the slaves and go to the West Indies. At the West Indies, they would get molasses, and then they would go back up to Rhode Island, Connecticut to get more rum and continue to do that. All right, that's it. It's long enough. Take care.